today and tell you a little bit about what I work on. So let me just share my slides. There we go. So I work for a small charity called the Campaign for Science and Engineering, and the project I want to talk to you today about is the one I lead, which is about making R&D, so research and development, matter to more people in society. And we've been doing a really big project to understand how all different types of R&D, so you've got your classic kind of sciences and mathematics, but actually the UK public fund a huge range of different types of research, including in the humanities and the arts. I had a look up, and actually the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK spent £100 million last year, public money on arts research. So it's a really interesting field and a really interesting topic to be working on. And our feeling is that more needs to be done to make sure that research feels accessible to more people and tangible to more people across all walks of life. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the project today, and I'd be really keen to take some questions if there's time for that. So as I say, I work for the Campaign for Science and Engineering. Just so that you know who we are and where I'm coming from, I'm an ex-lab scientist. I used to work on structural virology, looking down microscopes at how viruses form. And I now work for CASE, and CASE's mission as a charity is to put science and engineering at the heart of the UK's future. And, what do we mean by that? Well, we work with a whole range of member organisations. So all the big UK universities are members, R&D businesses, big and small, professional societies, as well as individual scientists and researchers across the country are all members and work with us to try and promote the idea of R&D. We try and represent R&D, particularly to politicians, and it probably won't surprise anybody to know that most politicians know very, very little about research at all. And actually, there's a huge amount of work to do to try and make sure that the idea of kind of innovation and change and technology and in all its different forms and research is something that is heard as a political priority. And we work really hard to make sure that that voice is heard within politics. We're non-partisan, so we don't work for any particular political party. We do this across all parties in the UK and all perspectives. And we really try and be experts. Everything is evidence-led. We collect data, we ask people, we really collect evidence and then try and use that to kind of decide our positions. So that's roughly who CASE are. My project is called the Discovery Decade, and it's about trying to really think about that point about where the public come into all of this. So we spend a lot of time talking to politicians on behalf of a sector of R&D people, but actually at times we forget that the fact that the public are paying for that and paying a huge amount of money. So the UK government spends around £20 billion a year on R&D in different forms. It's a huge amount of money. We build a lot of schools or hospitals for that. And the Discovery Decade work is trying to think about how do we make sure that the public feel more bought into that, that they understand what's happening, that they feel like it's the right priority, frankly, for politicians to be choosing to invest that money in R&D. And to really go back to basics and to make sure that, particularly as an ex-scientist myself, that I'm not letting my passion for science cloud the way we talk to people about it and its value and the difference that it can make to people's lives. So as I say, this is all about trying to think about the fact that when we are encouraging investment, public investment into research, that is coming alongside a lot of other very, very important and worthy choices. So whether that is filling in potholes or building more schools or hiring more nurses, those are all really good things to put money into. And I think there's a real challenge for something like research, which is it's often long term. It often doesn't have an immediate payoff. It's something about coming up with new ideas, big ideas for the future. But very, very understandably, particularly in a cost of living squeeze, we find that people don't feel like it's the right priority and it's not urgent. And so there's a real risk actually that the UK stops investing in those new ideas, stops putting money behind things that could really change society, and ends up some of those problems getting even worse because we don't have the answers to solve those problems. So that's very much what the project is about, is trying to answer this simple question, which is why should we put money into R&D and why now in particular? Times are hard. Is this the right priority for the moment? And so that's where we've been building this project, which is about trying to really understand how the public currently think about R&D. and then translating that into really practical ideas that the sector can use. So whether that's universities or big R&D businesses or science and discovery centers or schools, which is how do we talk to people about what R&D is, what it's for, who does it, where it happens, and make sure that we're doing that in a way that feels more tangible and gets hopefully moves away from the slightly kind of aloof crazy haired scientist with the big specs, he says with big specs, that we see kind of portrayed on TV and things, and really tries to say that actually this idea of kind of thinking about new ideas is something that we all do in our own lives, and actually is a really exciting career option. It's a way of contributing to society. It's something that we can all play a part in. And really trying to find the language that helps us do that, to get away from the slightly stuffy scientific approach to something that feels actually more exciting and that really opens up the fact that this is a huge opportunity for lots of people. And finally, we're also trying to find the moments and the places in the UK where we can really push ahead with that idea and try some of this stuff out. And in particular, I'll come back at the end that we're really focused on the general election, which is towards the end of this year, as a moment where politicians decide what matters to them. And we really want to make sure that we can talk about the fact that the public are interested in this. So to start with, I'll just talk a little bit about what we've heard from the public. And I don't want to kind of dwell on this, but just to say we've done a really big study. So we've been doing nationally representative polls covering 20,000 people. That's a really big sample. I've sat in focus groups across the country, hearing people talk about R&D in their own words. And we've published all of this as an open access resource, so we're not kind of holding on to any of this. Everything we do is freely accessible to anybody. But we really wanted to be evidence-led, and we wanted to be able to say, actually, with 20,000 people in our sample size, we're able to look at different groups. We don't just say, on average, people think this. We can say, well, actually, if you live in this part of the country, or you do this type of job, or your household has this type of income, or you've had this sort of educational experience, we can say how that changes your relationship with research and how you feel about it. And I think that's really valuable, and it lets us think about how we talk about the sector and what it does in different ways, and make that matter to what already matters to people themselves. So the challenge we have, we're looking at the data that's come back in our data collection, is that at the core of it, there's a bit of a dilemma, which is that to a lot of people in society, research as a whole seems like a good idea. People say it seems important, it seems useful. It's not a political issue, so this has support across the political spectrum, which is fantastic. Very few issues do these days, sadly. So there's a real sense here that a lot of people look at the idea of research of lots of different types and say, yeah, that seems useful. But the flip side of that dilemma is it doesn't feel urgent to a lot of people. So when we say to people, you think it's important, should we be putting money into it this year? People say, maybe not this year, maybe next year or 5 years from now. And actually, there's a real sense that people don't feel that this research has any impact on their lives, and that it feels like it can't compete with other pressing issues. So there's a real risk here that particularly people's experience through the COVID pandemic, for example, and the development of the vaccine has left a lot of people with a sense that research is something that you just do when you're in an emergency, and that the rest of the time you stop. And it's this kind of tap on and tap off situation. And I think there's a real risk there that we stop doing the sort of research that does change lives, that comes up with new ideas unexpectedly, that fills in those gaps and comes up with new stuff all the time, and instead end up turning that tap off just when we perhaps need it the most to fix things like climate change or rebuilding schools or fixing the NHS. And interestingly, I think for the discussion today is also there is a huge age trend in this. And, we showed that actually the younger you are, so if you're below 44, for example, so you're in the kind of bottom half of the age spectrum, you're much more likely to say that R&D doesn't feel urgent, that it doesn't benefit you, that it's something we invest too much money in, that the UK can't afford it. So there's a real challenge here that there's a big group in society that look at something like research, technology, innovation, and say that it's something that they don't want. And I think there's a real risk here that we end up stuck in a corner as a society where we don't have any new ideas to fix the big problems in society, and we've whittled away that ability to come up with those ideas. So we're really interested in how to kind of reach out to new audiences, and particularly bring a sense of opportunity back to the conversation about research. Particularly for this group, these are the people who are most squeezed by the cost of living crisis, and they've really suffered personal finances. They're seeing public services that they rely on suffer. And so there's a real desire for us to point point to the idea of research as a source of opportunity, not just in terms of jobs and careers for them, for their kids, for grandkids, but also actually, a sense of it creating tools and ideas that can help fix problems. It can build houses cheaper. It can make public transport cheaper to run. It can lower our gas bills. All the sorts of things that new technology can do. At the moment, this group aren't really hearing those messages, so we need to work much harder to get those across. So I won't dwell on it, but just to say that there's a few things that we've shown that really help build this connection and help research feel more tangible to more people. The two big things here are that research really struggles with feeling very abstract. As I said, people struggle to think about where it happens, who does it, what it's for. It's always viewed as this kind of like slightly kind of crazy scientists doing something in a deep underground lab. Nice that they're happy, but it doesn't really make much difference for the rest of the world. And we're really keen to be able to show that actually research happens across the whole of the UK. Almost every town in the UK has a university. We have research labs and businesses, startups. We have research happening in hospitals. It's happening down the road from all of us, and we're really keen to make sure that we talk more about the fact that R&D is something that happens nearby, that it's something that's part of your community. And then also to talk about the purpose of R&D. And at times scientists get so kind of cocooned in their own world that they love doing the science just for the science's sake, just because it's great to do. And we need to talk more about the problems that we're fixing, and the fact that these technologies and these ideas are helping solve climate change. They're helping develop new wind turbines or heat pumps that we can put on our house that are quieter and cheaper and smaller. That it's really helping us create those new ideas that can solve problems. And so there's a lot of work for us to do there about talking about both place and purpose with research to make it feel much more tangible, much more part of our communities, part of the sense of optimism and opportunity that are around people. So we are doing lots of things to try and get this message out there, and these are all available on our website, but we are steering those who are talking about research to talk about the aspects that really help it appeal to more people. So this idea of research as a tool for fixing things, it's not just this kind of like aloof abstract thing that's happening over there. It's actually a tool that you can look at a problem and come up with a new idea. We're really emphasizing that it helps the next generation. It sets up people in the future to have a better life than the one we've had. And I think there's a real desire there to emphasize that if we don't invest in this, the people that we're taking benefits away from are the children and the grandchildren that come ahead of us. So there's a real desire to try and talk about the fact that this is about helping other people, not just ourselves. We want to make sure that it feels relevant, that it's part of life, part of communities, links to things that we care about, and that idea that it's just down the road from us, because I think that's a really important aspect to R&D. And just to kind of quickly round up by saying that we're channeling all of these messages back to politicians as well, and we really want them to know that the public there's an opportunity here. The public are interested in research, but it needs to feel more relevant to them. It needs to feel more part of their community, something that people can see more often. And we're really talking to politicians about how to do this, how to invest public money in ways that helps people see what's happening, how to get people involved in more research, either deciding what problems to tackle or, contributing to things like clinical trials or product testing to really make sure that people feel like they can get involved in this and be part of the process. And as I say, we're doing lots of work around the election to really make sure that this idea is heard and that we try and land with whoever the next government are, that research is something that they can be proud of, that we can really lean into, that instead of kind of vacuous promises about leveling up and doing all these sorts of things, we can actually deliver some real change for communities and get people involved in something that does change their life. And that does make life easier, cheaper, quicker, simpler, all those sorts of things, and really try and lean into getting the community, the scientific community, to really think about how it talks about the value that it delivers. So I'll stop there, as that's a bit of a whiz through some of the things we've been doing. I'd be really keen to take questions. And just to say that I'm talking about this today, but I'm supported by a fantastic team of Becky and Lynn, who've been involved in collecting all of this data and helping analyze it. They were sorry they couldn't be here today, but it's really nice to kind of talk about the project as a whole. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks so much, Ben. It's really interesting to hear about. Obviously, we're all here today because we have some kind of interest in research. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. If not, I have a couple of my own. We have Samantha. Sam, go straight ahead.
Thank you for your talk. It's really, really interesting. I wanted to ask about language really, and I think one of the difficulties is this idea that science equals researcher.
Hmm.
I'm not a scientist, um, but I'm still a researcher, and
Mm.
I find often in the infrastructure, the research landscape is that research and development is always akin to the sciences,
Yeah.
when actually there's some fabulous, meaningful research that goes on using qualitative and arts-based methods.
That's a great question, Sam, and I think it dives straight to the challenge with all of this, which is I completely agree. I think at the moment, the way the kind of research sector talks about itself always gravitates back towards science and STEM, and the sorts of subjects that lean into the kind of stereotypes as well of what kind of research is. And I think it's such a shame because it masks and hides a huge amount of great, fantastic research that happens in lots of different walks of life. And that frankly, a lot of it feels far more relevant to people. You know, if you talk about digging a big hole under Switzerland to build a Hadron Collider, most people roll their eyes and say, sounds great, but like nothing to do with me. The fact is that the vast majority of research that does take part in people's communities, that really does have a closer impact on people's lives, is exactly as you say, social sciences research, it's arts, humanities research, it's methods that are far more people centric. They're much more about people in society and how they live. And I think that's a sort of lost opportunity for the sector. And it's a real shame. And it's one of the things we've been really focusing on is completely changing the language of the sector. And the way we've been trying to tackle that is by using the data and the focus groups to say to the public, you know, what comes to mind when we say these different types of words? And be able to show exactly as you predicted there, which is like people think of science and it just rose back to that. And then be able to go back to the kind of rest of the R&D sector and say, okay, we need to stop using these sorts of terms. We've really pushed away from the idea of using science as a term because I think it's far too narrow. And we're really encouraging people to talk about research and researchers and immediately kind of qualify that by showing that it's a very broad group. It's not just scientists in disguise. This is a really broad set of people working in lots of different environments. It's not just laboratories and kind of, crazy test tubes boiling over with stuff. This is actually about things that happen within communities. So yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's one of the core things at the heart of this is we've got to change how we talk about this. Otherwise, all we're doing is pushing against a brick wall.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tracy. Do you want to come in?
I think as well a sort of offshoot from that is how it's done.
Hmm.
I had to pull out of my major study because I couldn't cognitively process how to get it on the page. I could talk it to you. I could do you a presentation. I could, Abby, I used to speak to Abby a lot. I can talk it, but I could not because I've got a brain injury. I could not make that process from my brain to my hand to my keyboard.
Mm.
And that was a really big, I think that's probably, an issue for many that you just, and especially being a first generation academic as well, it's not in my wiring. I'm fighting against generations of non that not thinking that way, not working that way. And it felt like I was not just because of the physicality and the injury I've got, but it felt like I was fighting against every cell in my body to try and do this work, and I could not do it. And my wonderful tutor, said, "What would it feel like to let it go?" And it was just relief.
Yeah.
And that was the saddest thing because I was enjoying the process. I just could not put it on paper. So I think there's just something in that as well, I think.
Yeah, definitely, Tracy. And thanks for sharing that story. I think, and I think, a lot of people that would resonate with a lot of people, I think, of the often it's kind of archaic and old-fashioned approach that kind of is baked into a lot of research about how we share what we've found. And again, that just leans back into the kind of stereotype of this kind of sealed off world that communicates in jargon and complicated theses and huge tomes that no one reads and that don't feel accessible. And the reality is that if we do want to have an impact on more people's lives, it's about communicating what's done, what we've learned in ways that do relate to people, that it's about putting that in, forms of communication that are one, more modern and up to date, but two is what people actually engage with and want to read and want to see or listen to or watch. And I think at times, as you say, like we get so stuck as a sector or as a kind of group in this kind of like, oh, you've got to write a PhD thesis and it's got to be 40,000 words, otherwise it's not worth it. And you think, you know, I remember when I did mine and someone told me quietly, and they were like, 3 people will ever read this, and I'm sure I'd be lucky if 3 people have. And what a waste, right? Like, what an absolute waste of time for everybody involved. And I'd much rather have spent all those hours and days and months and years doing something that actually could be more useful to people and putting that information in a different
Yeah.
form. So I completely
I
agree.
think
I
it's,
think, yeah.
sorry,
Sorry.
I think it's, you know, and it's not wanting to cheat.
Mm.
You know, I didn't want to, you know, it's not doing the work to do the work. It's not doing the work to do the work. It's just the inaccessibility of doing the work.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Wonderful, thank you. I had to have a little giggle there, Ben, because before we started, I was saying to Michelle, Sophie, and Diane that I'm sure no one's read my PhD, but that I was so glad that this conference had come out of my PhD because it is tangible and that we're all here together, and isn't that wonderful? Got a lovely comment from Leslie in the chat as well, saying she's enjoying this shift to communities and focus groups, again, making it more accessible. And then a question from Colin says, could visual artists approach scientists and find ways to help communicate ideas in fun and accessible ways?
It's a really good question, Colin, and I think I'd be really supportive of that, of showing how, you know, you haven't got this kind of split between scientists and art, and you know, particularly the way it's funded in the UK, that sort of research, there is no split. So it's kind of a full split to share with the public. I've seen some really interesting schemes. I used to work for a charity called the Wellcome Trust, and they had a scheme which was about supporting artists to engage with scientists and produce something that helped articulate the art. And I think those programs are fantastic. They get the researchers to think very differently, which I think is worth its weight in gold at times. And I think it also generates outputs that are completely different from the usual sorts of things that come out of those studies. I sadly, I don't know if they're still running that program. I really hope they are, because I think it was an incredibly useful demonstration of doing things differently. And sadly, the sort of activity that often gets cut or brushed aside or considered a nice to have at the end of the project, whereas it should be something that you plan from the very beginning and is integral to how you're delivering your work. So I do think there is a real opportunity to make more of those links. And you know, the UK is deeply lucky to have a fantastic community of artists, of creatives, of people who produce things in different ways and make things incredibly exciting. And the fact is that often the science field completely walls themselves off from that, and I think it's a huge waste. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea, Colin. I really am. I'm going to look up whether Wellcome's still running that, and if they're not, I'll get back in touch with a colleague and tell them to do so.
Wonderful. Claire, would you like to come in?
Hi. It's so interesting about looking at different ways to publish your research. A friend of mine is doing a PhD in creative writing. She's written these lovely poems where she's interviewed local people throughout Essex. But she's invited me and some other artists to interpret her poems in our different sort of art forms, and she's going to present her PhD as an exhibition. So people can enjoy her poems through performance, through photography, illustration, and through textile art. So it's really interesting if you think about how to disseminate your practice. It doesn't just, like with poetry, everyone was like, oh, well, you're going to make a book. And actually she's like, no, she's dyslexic, so books aren't that accessible to her. And she just wanted to do it as this sort of immersive experience. So yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying about how it makes it more accessible and sort of almost more valid, really, as well.
I completely agree. I think it's a wonderful example, and I think, you know, we can already picture how much more impact and connection that's going to have than, as you say, just kind of publishing a book. And I think making sure that kind of funders and institutions are willing and very open to support those sorts of things, I think is going to be key.
Yeah,
a lot of what I used to work on at Wellcome was trying to kind of encourage an open mind about how to kind of share findings with communities, and to do that in a way that was led by what the community wanted. And rather than kind of just saying, I always publish a book, so I'm going to publish a book. So I think that's a fantastic example, and it's really
she's actually been successfully getting Arts Council funding to do it that way. So we're all getting paid, and yeah, so it's an amazing like success. Yeah,
that's fantastic. That's a really nice story, and I think that's a great example of really good practice.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Probably just got time for Mags for you to come in.
Hi, Ben. I'm an artist teacher working in a secondary school, and I'm doing an EdD at the moment, so very much based in my own school community. But just echo what everybody else has said about accessibility of writing it in the first place, Tracy, and and introducing my own art into my doctorate and blowing the minds of my lecturers that people communicate in this way. So I think that you very much do need to tap into that. But my question is, have you spoken with young people about research and what they think of it? Because what we find is research is happening more and more in schools now. So we may have a new generation that's coming through that you know have actually been asked, you know, many times over about different things. So I was wondering about how young people fit in this, please.
It's a really interesting question. So most of our data only goes down to 18, partly because of kind of safeguarding issues, but we've worked really well with the British Science Association, who've done an enormous amount of engagement with young people about research and where it fits in their lives, what their hopes are for it. And they've got some really good data actually about how young people approach this topic and how quickly views form and crystallize when you're young on this. And, you know, people, you know, young people kind of writing off the idea of research as something that's useful for them or accessible to them. So I think there's a really interesting set of challenges there. And I also worked with Science Foundation Ireland, which is the big kind of public science funder in Ireland. And a couple of years back, they ran a public-led research agenda. So they went out and asked everybody in Ireland, what do you think we should spend public research money on? What problems should we be trying to fix? And yeah, they did all sorts of fantastic things of kind of, they had a coffee van that drove around every town in Ireland and parked in the central square and gave people a free coffee if they came up and talked about problems or things that think, you know, research could solve. And two things. One is the vast majority of those were social science, humanities problems, because that's where people's lives are lived. And that's the problems that people are facing most of the time. So it's really changed views in Ireland about the types of research that are needed. And the second thing is they really went into schools. They did a really good engagement program with schools, kids of all different ages. And that yielded such a rich connection with young people of how they view this stuff and what they think its value is and where it can help and the sorts of focuses they'd like for it. And you know, it's worth having a look at it. The program was called Creating Our Future, and they've all the questions that they got back from the public have been published online. It's a fantastic resource to look at about how people innately relate to the idea of research. And yeah, really fascinating thing to look into. But it certainly for me has changed the conversation in Ireland about how to bring young people into this in a meaningful way, how to build a sector that is fit for them in their futures. And I think it's an incredibly exciting field, but certainly one that needs a lot more work to kind of deliver.
It's great work, Ben. It's great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Max.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben. And I'm just going to remind everyone of what Sophie and I were talking about right at the beginning of the conference, the upcoming AD issue, which is going to be looking at artist, educator and researcher identity. So maybe this conversation has started some ideas and we can all start to think about what it means to be researchers. But yeah, once again, thank you very much, Ben. Lovely to see you again. We are going to head off for our lunch now. Diane has very helpfully popped a little reminder in the chat for what you need for our creative workshop later, that Mags, who we just heard from, will be facilitating for us. But straight after lunch, we are going to jump into our next parallel sessions. So if you can return promptly for 1:50, that would be wonderful. I hope you've all had a lovely time so far. I know I have. So we'll see you in about half an hour. Enjoy your lunch.